Thanks for joining us here in the KRQE News 13 Digital Studio. I'm Chris McKee, joined again by investigative reporter Gabrielle Burkhart. Gabby, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Chris.
And as you see by the graphic down below, we are talking about your latest investigation. This is involving what's been a long-standing closure of what we often know as the Tent Rocks National Monument, but it also, of course, has a very specific name I'll let you pronounce for us. But
Kasha-katuwe.
There we go.
Tent Rocks, yeah.
This is a story you've been working on for a while, and I want to give people a look at what it looks like online here on our website. If they haven't checked it out yet, make the font a little bit bigger there for you. But why has Tent Rocks been closed for 3 years? That's the big question. We're going to talk a little bit more about this investigation here today. I like looking at this online as well because you can really get a picture right at some of the old school photos here that you've included.
That's from 1992, courtesy of Dr. Gary Smith, who was just a wealth of information regarding historical context of this site, but we can get into that for sure.
Yeah, so if you haven't checked it out yet, take a look at it online. You can also look at the post that this video is on krqe.com for a link in there to the story. So let's talk a little bit more about Tent Rocks. For those who don't know, it is really a geologic wonder here for New Mexico. It's an amazing site, and just to start off, you've been there, right, Gabby?
Yes, my first visit to the site was in 2015, I believe, with some friends, and it is just my first time seeing it. I was like, wow, this is so close to Albuquerque, and the geology just looks vastly different than any urban part of, the city, and it's just, you could do it in a day trip. It was an easy hike, you didn't have to be super athletic to complete the whole trail or get to the top, and there was a lot of people there. You can feel the cool air as you're hiking through the slot canyons, and it's just really incredible to see up close.
What makes this place so unique? If you can tell us just a little bit about, I know you talk mildly about this, right, in your story here, but for those who maybe haven't caught the story yet, listening to this first, what makes this place so unique?
Well, I mentioned it's geographically really unique. These hoodoos, these formations you see, those are called hoodoos, and they're really etched out of the ash of volcanoes that happened 6 to 7 million years ago.
Yeah.
And so geologists, the gentleman that I interview is part of my story, Dr. Gary Smith, he started studying the geology there in 1988 with some UNM students, and he's been at UNM, and he was interested in volcanoes, and that sort of led him to this area. And his research really helped lead to the designation of it becoming a national monument in 2001, which we can get into.
Yeah.
But so it's right on the edge of Cochiti Pueblo lands. And for anyone who hasn't been out there, it's not super far from Santa Fe, Bernalillo, or Rancho, Albuquerque. It's about a 45-minute drive from where we're at.
You have to drive through the Pueblo to get there.
Yes, you have to drive through the Cochiti Pueblo, which is why it's still closed, which we can also get into. But the actual Kasha-katuwe Tent Rocks National Monument sits on BLM land, which some people might not have known. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't, it's outside of the Pueblo boundary, but the way that the presidential designation of it being a national monument is that it's co-managed by the BLM and Cochiti Pueblo. So in partnership, they maintain the site, have workers there when it is open to take, the fee from visitors as you would go. It used to be $5 that you just drive through, pay your, parking fee, and then get out and explore.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about what got you on this story. For background, just for folks who haven't really been paying too much attention to this narrative, this monument had been open to the public for regular visitation essentially for decades. And then the pandemic hits, and we saw closures for a lot of areas throughout the United States, and specifically as well, many through New Mexico. And a lot of those closures for pueblos as well lasted for far longer than we saw, at least just in off Pueblo land throughout New Mexico for varying reasons. But let's get to that point, though. This was open for regular visitation and then all of a sudden closed, and it has been closed since then, basically, since 2020. What got you on this story?
Well, just the broad question of trying to figure out the answer. We were getting questions from the general public, as I'm sure BLM and Cochiti were as well. Why is this place still closed? You know, it's a national monument. It's a publicly visited site. It's also super popular when it comes to just tourism advertising. I was seeing ads on my phone with images of the slot canyons, and then people posting in the thread like, why is this still closed? And, you know, it's still kind of being advertised like, hey, come visit New Mexico and you can see this. But you really couldn't because it's still closed. And regarding the COVID shutdowns, I think one of the big questions was, you know, early on in the pandemic, they did close a lot of the outdoor spaces in national parks. But then, you know, we quickly realized outdoor spaces were safer than indoor spaces and where people would go to recreate. And so the question, I think, then really became, well, you know, why is a national monument outdoors where people can recreate and visit, and it's someplace as cool as the Tent Rocks? You know, why was it still closed? So just finding the answer to that basic question, I went on a mission and just started putting out emails and phone calls to anyone and everybody that I could. And I started doing that, I think, in January, February. But yeah.
It sounds like it became far more of a hard answer to obtain than one would think on the initial point of just asking, why is this still closed? But before we get into that, I think we should go through maybe a little bit of history of there. You talked a little bit about this. This is just outside of the Pueblo boundaries. It's on BLM land. There was this push for conservation back basically in the year 2000, towards the end of Bill Clinton's second term. You actually, I did not talk to you about this beforehand because I wanted to surprise you with it, went back into the tapes, into the archives, found this soundbite from December 2000, and I want us to all take a look at this right now. This is U.S. Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt, who, before this was declared a monument, this is what happened out there. We covered this as a news story back in December 2000.
The important opportunity here is to put together a new kind of partnership between the Bureau of Land Management and the Cochiti tribe so that we can kind of ignore the boundaries on maps and say that we're going to work together to protect, interpret, and administer this landscape.
So if you didn't catch that first part, he said it is an important opportunity here to put together a new kind of partnership between BLM and Cochiti. And of course, we talked a little bit about eventually that did become a partnership where there is some co-management happening on the site. But interesting to see the video all the way back there from December 2000. So this was an act, though, that was essentially finalized in the final days of the Clinton presidency, is what it sounds like.
Yeah, and this was an interesting piece of history that I learned as well. So in my search to find anyone who would talk to me about Tent Rocks, we can get into this, but I reached out to the Interior Secretary's office, the State Tourism Department, and some of our representatives, Teresa Ledger Fernandez, even Senator Martin Heinrich's office, because I know he's very interested in outdoor preservation, those types of things. And I was just getting either no calls back or one-line answers saying, we will not be participating in this story at this time, which I felt was like kind of curious and strange. Like, is there a mystery that I'm missing here? But in my search to find somebody to talk to, I actually landed what I would say as an investigative journalist, one of the best interviews. I found a guy at UNM, not just a guy, his name is Dr. Gary Smith, and he has been working at UNM since the 80s as a geologist. And like I said, he was one of the earlier sort of earlier people to start studying this area. And he would take out some fellow students and classes, host field trips to the tent rocks, and this is like back in the 80s and 90s before there was any talk of it becoming a national monument. Well, so then in 2000, from that clip that you just played, the BLM approached Dr. Smith, knowing that he had been studying the area. I'm going to my notes here. They pointed out that President Clinton's Interior Secretary at the time was working to bring this to the president's attention, a number of federal lands that could potentially be designated as a national monument, invoking the Antiquities Act of 1906, which allows presidents to make national monuments, to designate national monuments rather than Congress. So among the historical, cultural, scientific importance, and this being a, potentially vulnerable piece of land that could be lost out there if we didn't preserve it, Dr. Smith actually helped draft the wording and proposal that they used to submit this to the president and ask him, if they would designate this a national monument. So, but before even 2001, when President Clinton signed the presidential proclamation designating Kasha-katuwe tent rocks as a national monument, it did become a little bit more popular in the 1990s. They designated back then what's called an area of critical environmental concern, and then they went, and it used to be just dirt. There were no roads like leading directly to it. And back in the 90s, they closed off some of those areas to off-roading tracks, like off-roading vehicles. You had to park in a designated area. But then once we got the presidential proclamation, you saw investments into preserving that. So there was a road put in, and we covered that, back in the 2000s. And they really looked at it as a way to sort of preserve the cultural, historical, geological significance of this site. But then as we can get into, it was kind of a double-edged sword, right? Because once you see a national monument on a map, people are going to notice and say, oh, I want to go check that out. And so you get just exponential number of visitation increase, which is another thing I learned.
Yeah, and so these numbers were just up here on the screen. This is from essentially a science report that was put up in 2020, it sounded like, when that report was published from the BLM, talking about just how much use there is at the site. And you can see that from 2,000, 14,000 folks, all the way up to 2019 data. You're talking about 5 times as many, if not more than 5 times as many visitors. Just a significant increase.
And then in 2001, that's when it was designated a national monument. So you can see just from there how much visitation increased, foot traffic. So then you start worrying about, are we able to maintain this site and preserve it and for future generations? And that's a concern. In this same scientific report that was published in 2020, it also mentioned that they anticipated roughly 50,000 visitors per year. So it's like they were getting more than twice that right before the COVID shutdowns. So Dr. Smith told me in his own words, it's not surprising that they used the shutdown as sort of a time to step back and reflect, maybe reassess how they were going to move forward into making sure the public could still visit and see this wonder, but also be able to maintain it for future generations.
Why do you think it was so hard, and perhaps you don't have an answer for this, but one of the questions I'm left with is, why was it so hard for anybody to talk about the fact that this is the primary concern? It just seems like, nobody was willing to really go on record and acknowledge the fact that, there's just a serious concern about preservation here. I know it was posted to the BLM's website, but, for a number of years as well, COVID was continually used as that sort of, one of the tent poles, if you will, of why this closure continued, even as everything started to open up. And it really took, it sounded like, just an incredibly long time for anybody to come forward and be like, okay, the reason why it's closed is we need to have a better plan. And I guess my question to you is, why did it seem like it took so long to really get that answer? I know BLM finally did speak to you, but it was, after a
Yeah.
long time, and also the Pueblo didn't speak about this.
Yeah. The Pueblo didn't want to comment. I did finally get somebody on the phone, because the number on the website where it says, you can call Cochiti Pueblo, or it would just ring and ring and ring and never allow you to leave a message. So my point of contact was mostly with the BLM, and they were just sort of, I don't want to use the word secretive, but just not forthcoming about what was happening behind closed doors. Initially, they gave me a statement, so they were updating statements on their website in the weeks of my inquiries regarding Tent Rocks, and with a little more detail than previous updates. So initially, it was just it remains closed due to the COVID-19 shutdown.
Yeah.
Here's some other places you can visit in the meantime, and check back for updates.
Yeah.
But literally, days before I told them that this story was going to air, I got a call back from BLM saying okay, we're ready to do a Zoom interview with you. And so I did that, and the answer that I got was, and I can quote her, Jamie Garcia. She is an outdoor recreation planner with the BLM, worked at the monument site, and they are in talks, meeting regularly with Cochiti Pueblo. They have submitted business plans about how the reopening would look, but nothing has been set in stone, so I'm told. But Jamie Garcia said, out of respect for that tribal sovereignty, for them, meaning Pueblo de Cochiti, to be able to make that decision, we are continuing the closure. So working together, we don't have a date quite set yet.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, and this was, okay, so on Friday, I believe it was, the World Health Organization announced, we all got news alerts saying that COVID-19 was no longer a global threat, according to the WHO, the World Health Organization. And we know that our, U.S. president and our governor and everybody, they've lifted all those COVID restrictions. But if you go to Cochiti's website, it says the Pueblo is still closed due to COVID-19 restrictions and concerns. So they don't want any non-tribal people, basically. They don't want the public driving through there just yet. And the BLM basically told me, out of respect for their sovereignty, they can choose what they want, how they want to protect their people and their land. And so it's sounds like it's up to them on when they're ready to reopen the gates again to the public.
Yeah, it is interesting, because I think while this is, clearly, as you had mentioned, it's a BLM property, they also have recognized through the decades the historical and the cultural significance of this site, and that, the semblance I get is that it's about being as respectful as possible to that idea and to the Cochiti Pueblo about the next decision, and that, nobody really just wants to get in front of it or say something that they're going to regret in the end. But, that being said, it also makes me question, well, why not just say that to begin with, that people want to be respectful?
Yeah.
So,
well, and it sounds like just from researching this place and the significance of it, actually our former helicopter pilot reporter, Bob Martin, who a lot of you know, he did a great piece about this site that I rewatched. Where a lot of his
videos coming from.
Yeah, and he had the drone flying over, and he interviewed some of the Pueblo people back then, and they were just telling him about, this place not only holds geographical significance, but it's a spiritual place for a lot of the Cochiti people. So I know that, for them, this place means a lot. For New Mexico, it means a lot to preserve. So I think they're being very careful about how they'll reopen it. BLM did tell me we can probably expect increased fees. I mentioned the $5 fee back then.
Yeah.
She's like, everything costs more. Now we have the staff, maintenance, so we'll probably see increased fees, probably see some sort of online reservation system, like timed ticketing. And honestly, that would probably be nicer than we did a story back in 2018 about the long lines of visitors for spring break at Tent Rocks. People were waiting just in their vehicles over 90 minutes to park their car.
Wow.
So if you think about where we've come as far as online reservation systems and time ticketing through the pandemic, that would probably help a lot.
Very interesting. Well, Is there any timetable that you can guess right now? The sense I get from you is no, that it's really just a decision that they're waiting for everybody to come to the table and have an agreement on. But did you get a sense of any timetable?
I asked multiple times,
Yeah.
but yeah, I kind of got the answer that we'll just see when the Cocha de Pueblo decides to open its gates again to the public. So
Yeah.
they said, BLM says we welcome everybody to visit other public lands, and there's other beautiful sites and hidden gems.
Certainly.
And that they're welcoming actually to people to call them and ask if you're trying to plan a trip to New Mexico and want to go exploring.
Gabby, how can people reach you if they want to maybe give you a little insight on what's happening here, or perhaps have another story idea?
The best way is via email. That way I have it in writing. We have been getting a lot of tips lately to our KRQE Investigates unit, which is nice to hear from the public, but it is always helpful to have like something in writing where I can go back to in my notes. Gabrielle.burkhart@krqe.com.
Okay. Gabby, thanks again. We appreciate you joining us. And for folks who want to ever check out any more investigations, thanks again for being here.
Thank you.